Great. I think we're going to get started. My name is Jada McKenna. I have the privilege of being the deputy coordinator of the Feed the Future initiative, and I also got to enjoy one of the breakout sessions, so I am very much looking forward to hearing what came out of the other ones. So welcome back, and let's dig right into hearing from the leaders from the 4 breakout sessions. May I start with Dr. Bartuska? In each section, what you're going to hear is a brief summary of the major areas identified for potential partnership and the concrete next steps that the groups came up with.
Well, we'll see. I think the best part was there was a lot of engagement in a very crowded room, similar to many of yours, and I think we have a commitment of a group of people to move forward. The specifics, I'm not sure we've really nailed it all down, but we've got some really good ideas out there. So for my group, thank you very much. I'm just going to run through, I think, what the highlights are. There's some other discussions that took place, a lot of very good information, and we gathered the notes from that, or we took notes during that time. So the punchline, can you hear me well enough if I stand here? Rick's great, okay. The punchline is, why do we not have a fully integrated multi-sectoral approach to global capacity building in agriculture? We haven't done that. We've got pieces, and so what we started talking through, and part of it is the sustainable intensification does fit that model, this concept of being very holistic, but we've got a lot of, again, we have the pieces, but we don't have the whole system. And so what we threw out there was, this might be the end game that we get to, and then how do we line up the parties to get there, and how do we do that? But then what are some of the components? And so then we got down to a little bit of more granularity on the subjects, and there were 3 maybe high-level things that came out that were all integrated, and that's what these little pluses mean. That one of them is there needs to be a laboratory infrastructure in all of these communities that will be able to sustain the technology, the development, the new tools to be able to really look at by the way, my subject was genomics, crop, and livestock. I should have said that right from the beginning. So in that space, that's why labs are so important. You got to have a place to do that. But you can't do that if you don't have a workforce that is trained, that has the skills, that is developed along with the laboratory infrastructure to do the work. So workforce development becomes very important, and that of course leads to all sorts of institutional developments. It leads to an academic university community that actually can help train those individuals. It actually probably fits really well with the extension discussions you all have been talking, because how do you take that information and move it out? And so part of that, it's the lab, it's the workforce, but then it's also the computational and cyber infrastructure, because we got lots of data in the genomics world, both from the genotyping side and the phenotyping side. We've got to be able to look at it, and so you have a whole lot of aspects to that need to be grown up and developed at the same time from a global capacity building. I have a little note here, open access. That's really part of it, is how do you make this information available to those who can use it in real time. And then we added a 4th item through further discussion. That's the political, and I'll come back to that. Okay, so that's the end game. Then we did get to where could we make some personal commitments. What I should have had is a light come on right here. And there was a lot of energy around this idea of, we have private sector labs who need people to be trained, to learn, to take the information and move out with it, but also to bring it into the countries where they could be working. And so this idea of providing postdoc opportunities, graduate experiences in a very deliberate way, but using the capacity of the U.S. government to help make that happen. So a lot of people signed up for that. They really feel like this is an easy, well, maybe not so easy because there's visa issues, but there is a lot of commitment to being able to provide this kind of opportunity. And of course, the key will be this lab infrastructure piece, because you get people trained, you bring them into a laboratory system, they learn, they need to have a place to go back to that will keep that learning, that keep that knowledge. And so anyway, we see that this is a real opportunity in many of the countries that we're working in. We had a similar piece around actually the genomics component as well as the phenotyping, developing the databases that actually will help inform what are the different agricultural crops and livestock systems that we need to have knowledge on so that we can do the genomics and interpret the genomics. And there were several companies that signed on to that, not as many, but this is the big list. So I wanted to show this here. But then we also wanted to see where are there opportunities to start talking the talk in a unified way. And so there's this one thing called policy context. And there really seemed to be a sentiment going back to that global capacity building in agriculture to get some alignment. We have a lot of different pieces moving and swirling around that really should start looking similar or mutually reinforcing. Feed the Future is probably the starting point or the kernel based on what we've done here. But we have the G8 meetings coming up. We have the G20 discussions taking place. From the corporate sector of the World Economic Forum, we ought to have the same words, the same concepts start showing up in all those places so that we are reinforcing what the key items are. And it all comes back to this global capacity building in agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bartuska. Our virtual group actually went through all 4 sessions, so I can't imagine that just after that great readout, it'll be fun to see how their things compare. May I have Bill Kraft come up to talk about seed technology?
I'm bringing my friend Michael.
Okay. Yes, entourage.
Okay. So, we were talking about seed technology and dissemination of the products. And there were a couple of overarching themes, one of which is the criticality of getting good local partners to work with you. Another was the importance of trying to do things in a regional basis, because even if you get the regulatory systems and the other systems right in one country, if you don't have similar systems set up in the neighboring countries, then you've got problems of inability to sell your product, or repercussions if the seeds migrate across borders, because they do. So we talked about a number of things, including the regional issue, and obviously, like many others, we were focusing primarily on East Africa. Our group came up with 4 basic group concepts, and one of the nice things is that almost everybody volunteered to be on almost everything, so that made it simpler. The big elephant in the room in seed land is the regulatory process. And we talked about the importance of trying to do things as a sort of life cycle seed system. Product stewardship was another concept. So we need to find ways to talk about this with countries that have very ineffective regulatory systems, sort of from the all the way through the process from the beginning to the end. Oh, Michael, did I forget anything major on that one?
No.
Okay. The second group that we talked about was we called it field management, which are to set up, among other things, sort of answer plots or demonstration projects. And there is some work being done in Kenya on this already, but there's a lot of room there to expand. And we thought we'd start by reaching out to AID Mission Kenya to see if they can work with us to try to broaden the demonstration projects that are already underway. There, again, to be able to take local farmers and show them how these things can work, what works, what doesn't, and what the productivity impacts are would be very effective. The third group we looked at was communication as a tool, and we agreed that we desperately needed to find ways to get the knowledge of what the productivity gains and the efficiency gains of some of the new technologies, whether they're hybrids or more exotic technologies, are, and that we need to help build farmer demand. And in part, this means reaching out and touching the dealers and the extension programs that already exist, to helping set up extension programs where they don't exist, and moving forward. We all, in our heart of hearts, want to try to build public support for, public demand for biotechnology or genetically modified products. But frankly, given the budget constraints that both the private sector folks and the public sector folks are under, that may be a bridge too far, at least on a grand scale. And then the fourth project we talked about, and USTDA has agreed to take the lead on this, working with the State Department and the others on the government side, is to pull together a group just to talk about resources. On the government side, we did this sort of 2 years ago when we were starting Feed the Future, and we had show and tell where AID described what they were doing and USDA described what they were doing and state described what we were doing, and we discovered that there were certain areas of overlaps and there were some gaps. What we discovered during the course of our 2 hours is that there were a number of projects being done by groups like CropLife or other Land O'Lakes, other companies that were new and exciting to some of us. And so we decided that we needed to have a group that got together and talked about what resources our embassies in places like Kenya and elsewhere could bring to bear on this issue, make the public sector people aware of what the private sector people were already doing or prepared to do, and similarly have the private sector people learn what the public sector people could do, were doing, and were prepared to do, so that we could get together and try to reduce the level of overlaps and hopefully identify and then do something about whatever gaps in coverage, either on the communication side or on the regulatory side, that we hadn't captured yet. Michael, what did I forget?
I think the only thing that I would mention is that, there was a lot of interest around these 4 projects, but they're still in the very formative stage. So I think there's a desire to have particular projects in these thematic areas, but it's going to take the folks getting together to figure out exactly what the tool is that are going to be used for each of these things. There was mention of things like mentorships, but it's not exactly clear in which project those kinds of things are going to be. So I think those are details that are going to be worked out in subsequent meetings, and there will be subsequent meetings.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. These are action-oriented readouts, so thank you in advance for agreeing to the subsequent meetings as we take what you're coming out with to fruition. I'd like to welcome Dr. Julie Howard to come up to talk about what the Extension Breakout team developed.
Thanks, Jada. It sounds like all of the groups, our group included, had kind of a wall-to-wall discussion, extremely active, lots of ideas. We spent a lot of time sort of going around learning about our group's experiences in this space, which I found was very, very important. So we had some folks who had experience with call centers that they had funded on a proprietary basis, and now wondering whether or not they might expand those to include some sort of public element. That was one sort of direction. We had another. We also had the answer plots in our group. Sort of a question about whether an answer plot that started with one group can successfully incorporate other input dealers or other private companies to make it a little bit more sustainable. So we had those kind of experiences, and it was interesting. I was struck by sort of this wave of resistance to the idea that, this is a simple problem. Extension is not something that you can flip a switch and say, okay, we have hardly any working public extension sector in countries that we're interested in. We can't replace it by e-extension. There's just too much of a gulf. Even when we're thinking about the Green Revolution experience, there was a lot more human capacity already there in terms of people already knowing essentially how to read or write. And oftentimes in the countries where we're working, we don't even have that. So I think somebody said, stuck with me, said, farmers who have not made the transition from open pollinated to hybrid or to a significant improved practice are not going to respond to a text message telling them to, do something different. So I think that's very, very sort of encourages us to be a little bit humble. And also to realize that this is not a transformation that's going to happen overnight, and it's actually something that requires multiple layers of thinking. So thinking about how to create a knowledge base from which multiple users of extension, including e-extension, but also providers at the village market level or private sector extension providers through agri-input dealers might draw from. So I think that's that was one of the takeaways, is that we decided we needed to do some more learning as a group, that we agreed. We have 2 private sector co-chairs to work with us on follow-up briefings. We thought there's enough experience out there with e-extension and with private sector-led extension and some impact evaluation studies out there that we needed a briefing on to understand what's the business model that drives e-extension, and how do we know if it's going to be 1 input provider in the answer plot or 5 or 10 that's going to make that sustainable. So we agreed as a kind of first step in follow-up, Jada, to convene an e-briefing on the mFarmer, on the extension program, to just make sure we're wrapping up what we know and what guidance, and think together about what guidance that gives us. I think the other 2 things that came out were a general sort of sense of geographic focus on East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, but also quite a lot of interest in Latin America, possibly working in Guatemala, thinking of a project we might do there together. Also some interest in Cambodia, Nepal area, and Bangladesh. So, a few centers where people are already working and express some interest in thinking about how to partner with others. What else? I think there are 2 other things that came out that are not, I wasn't expecting, when I came into the group. One was contributions that the private sector can make are not just contributions on the ground at the answer plot level. Several private sector companies talked about the contributions they made to training. So working with the local university or the local community college to provide course material on a very specific aspect. And I think that came up, Anne, in your group as well, in terms of, what kind of capacity building companies do that's not strictly, at the point of sale. So I think that's something very interesting. And then the other was, quite a strong feeling that there needed to be some education of the public sector and public officials and policymakers about the importance of maintaining a base of public extension. So we thought about, is there a campaign? What kind of education might that be? But that would be a good thing to explore, follow up on. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. I think you raised the bar. You spoke about specific geographic areas, so it sounds like you're a little further ahead in your programming. Margaret Ennis, do you want to come up and talk about the ag finance and risk management? Do you want to one-up Julie?
No. Yeah, so for the Ag Finance and Risk Management Group, we discussed a range of finance mechanisms and found that 4 common areas of interest emerged as we in our discussion. One was looking at warehouse receipts, as it gives confidence needed for both potential buyers and financiers. And one of the things needed, though, in that is capacity building and in managing such a system. Equipment finance came up several times as being particularly challenging because of the perceived risk and the size of the investments. And we discussed how loan guarantees could be one tool to help that, but also the market linkages are crucial for being able to finance something like that. We also discussed a lot about the preconditions needed for really getting access to finance or making finance work, and that's having smallholder organizations, a market that makes sense, that's stable, enabling environment factors came up, insurance and risk management as really a precondition to being able to provide some of these other types of financing. And then finally, we discussed a lot on when you have a guaranteed market or buyer combined with capacity building by for the farmers so that they can meet the requirements, that lowers the risk and facilitates access to commercial finance. And with that, we also discussed the need for flexible financing platforms that can accommodate a number of these different types of needs. So with coming from that, we decided to start with a few specific projects that each one was of interest to multiple companies, and so we thought this would be a good place to start. One was looking at the poultry sector in Ghana, which includes the development of the soy sector for feed is one of the key components of that, as well as capacity building in both soy and poultry and related parts of the value chain, which could also imply cold storage and some other things. But concentrating on that as an area to show with the buyer linkages, the finance, and the capacity building. And then we also discussed equipment finance in Tanzania, in the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, looking at the fact that there are efforts that have enabling environment, flexible financing platforms being put into place for that region, other private sector interest. That could be a good place to test some of those possibilities related to that. And then we also talked about exploring specifics on warehouse receipts further. We hadn't defined a specific country project yet for that. So in terms of the next steps, we wanted to exchange contacts so it wouldn't just be, so we could continue the dialogue among all the private sector participants and U.S. government participants. Information exchange about what's going on, not just on the U.S. government side, but the different private sector initiatives and areas of interest. And then development of the specific projects we've discussed as next steps on that. So we look forward to coordinating with everybody on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. Wow, this is very, very exciting. It's especially encouraging because I think it really just highlights the new moment that we are in development and in partnership with the countries that we want to work on. It's no longer just donors and the partner country. Just from this experience, from other experiences we've had with the World Economic Forum and working with Global Harvest, it really is now a new paradigm where it's donors, it's the governments and the private sector companies themselves, both international private companies working hand in hand with local private companies. And a lot of the specific ideas that were mentioned really show the power of that model and how that's going to be moving forward. Just last week, the president of Tanzania, President Kikwete, hosted a ministerial for countries who've joined a new forum called Grow Africa, which is a joint effort between the World Economic Forum and the African Union. And it's specifically around how to create these country-level platforms for stronger private sector engagement and how to really move from a world of donor-driven assistance to really specific economic development in specific areas. So it's really exciting, and we're really honored that you've taken the time today to be with us to develop these concepts further, to have 70 people here with very busy lives come and give us ideas on how we Feed the Future as a whole of U.S. government can work with you is truly remarkable. So thank you very much. We will be sending specific readout of what you heard here. We'll also, I'm sorry, I forgot a session. I'm sorry. Okay, we'll have a readout, but before we get the readout to you, I'll have Lana Stahl come up to do the last session. I'm sorry.
So while we've all been here in the White House Conference Center, we've actually had colleagues that have been part of a virtual session too. And so a group of about 25 to 30 individuals have sought to do what all of you did in 2 hours in about 20-minute segments on each of the topics. So they didn't quite get to the level of specificity that some of our groups that had to focus for much longer did. But a couple of the thoughts actually dovetail nicely with the conversation here in the room. On extension, they also talked about building the information that we have on the existing ways that public and private partners are already doing extension and knowledge sharing and information sharing. So that seems to fit nicely with the learning agenda that Julie presented on. On genomic-type partnerships, they talked about looking at models from other sectors of the economy, like what's going on in the biomedical sector, and seeing if there were lessons from those types of partnerships that could translate into agricultural genomics, and looking at specifically some of the activities that have happened in the fortification realm as success stories. They talked about on biotechnology and just new technology introduction, looking at are there ways to leverage the various activities of both government and private sector to help with preparing packages that are being submitted for regulatory approval, for example, and building some of the capacity of local actors to do that. But then beyond just biotech, also looking at just how can we talk about enhancing the biodiversity options that farmers have and the different not necessarily biotech, but new technologies that could be made available. And then finally, they talked about on the agricultural finance and risk management. I think they probably didn't have as diverse of a group as we had here in person, so they just talked about how it was so cross-cutting and really needing to think about how do we do better outreach as a community to some of the local agricultural and rural financing community and the types of countries that we're talking about, and how do we really bring them into this dialogue too, and think about that knowledge and expertise factoring in. So, yeah. So thanks to all of the virtual participants who have plugged in throughout the course of the day today.
Thanks, Lana. Did I forget any other sessions? And I hadn't forgotten about the virtual team, and think it is actually, it's quite impressive that they did do all four. As I was saying, you will be getting readouts of this, and the conversations will continue virtually, as our virtual group did, as well as in person. And I know that we have specific people taking things forward in the different areas, so we look forward to following that over time. Before I turn it over to Bill Lesher to close out today, I've thanked you all for coming. I also want to thank my U.S. government colleagues for putting this together, particularly Marcella Szymanski. Marcella, where are you? Oh, did she step out? Marcella, yay, thank you. And Lana Stoll for also working with her. We had people from 6 different USG agencies here today, which those of you who haven't worked in government know that's no small feat. And to have us all on the same page, I think we've come very far. So thank you very much. That's really exciting. Before I turn it over to Bill, I just want to add a personal note. Bill, I know that you're soon leaving Global Harvest, and I want to just thank you for your personal commitment to agricultural development and food security. I also know that you could be tempted back into still working and contributing, and I know that your commitment will still sustain. So thank you very much. So with that, I will turn it over to you to officially close.
Well, it's been a long and fruitful day, and so I just want to say once again to thank the Feed the Future, all the folks have been working on it. And my sense is you're so open and willing to work with everyone, the NGOs, but also the private sector. And so I really want to say a big thank you to that. And the last thing I'll say is I think the private sector owes you all something. In other words, you cannot sit back in the private sector and say, well, we should do this or they should do that or whatever. These are all folks who are willing to help you. All you have to do is contact. So I think the administration is going to continue on this path, and my implore the private sector then to get engaged, to contact and share all your issues, problems, suggestions, or whatever it is. And so, and with that, this is going to work out to be a good deal. Jada, thank you so much.